welcome back everybody to the next segment of the American V8 history. Today we are going to talk about the Pontiac line of engines that were produced from 1955 on. Pontiac V8 engines were cast at the Saginaw Engine Foundry and they were assembled at the Tonawanda Engine Assembly Plant and then shipped to the factory for the Pontiac vehicles. What's interesting about the Pontiac engines is they used one block dimension or size for all of their engines, with only a couple of exceptions where they had in the later years some lower deck heights, but for the most part all of the Pontiac engines were the same block. Many of the manufacturers had big blocks and small blocks. Pontiac never had a big block or a small block. It was just a Pontiac engine, so it was the same block for all of their cubic inch displacements. They just changed the bore and the stroke combinations of the engines to achieve larger or smaller displacement engines. Now in 1932, Pontiac actually produced a V8 engine for 1 year. It was a flathead V8 and it was produced back when Pontiac was actually part of the Oakland Car Company, and that engine was only produced for 1 year and then they kind of went away with it. The following year they actually went to a straight inline 8-cylinder, and it was also a flathead that they used for many years in pretty much all of their vehicles, at least their higher end vehicles. In 1955, Pontiac produced their first overhead valve V8 engine. Now what's unique about Pontiac is the Pontiac V8 engine was actually on the drawing board and in the testing phase for about 9 years before it was actually produced. Pontiac had plans to produce and manufacture the overhead valve V8, but they had become part of General Motors at the time, and General Motors actually put the brakes on Pontiac and said, you need to hold off on your overhead valve V8. We are gonna have Buick and Oldsmobile produce their overhead valve V8s first. And so because of testing and engineering delays and delays from General Motors, the Pontiac engine that actually had been already engineered and was in the testing phase wasn't produced until 1955. When the Pontiac V8 was actually produced, it had over 1 million hours of testing in actual test vehicles. They had 20 or 30 of those that went through extensive testing. In those days, having that much testing into a V8 was unheard of, and over the years of testing for the Pontiac engines, they were able to eliminate a lot of the flaws and the bugs that were in those engines. And so when Pontiac in 1955 actually produced their V8, it had very few problems, and it was actually a very solid power plant. The first 4 years of the Pontiac V8, they used a reverse flow cooling system in the engines, which was unique in the industry. The first engine that was produced in 1955 was 287 cubic inches, and it had a bore of 3.750 and a stroke of 3.250. So it was an over square engine, which is a good combination for a decent performing engine. Large bore and shorter stroke. The 287 was named the Strato Streak. Now, one of the things that you'll notice in the 50s is a lot of the car companies they had a space age theme. The Olds Rocket, they had space age fins on the car. A lot of the Chrysler cars had fins, the Cadillac had fins. So it was kind of a space age type theme, and so you see a lot of that in the names of some of these engines and the design of the cars, and Pontiac was no exception. So the Strato Streak or Stratosphere Streak engine was 287 cubic inch, the first Pontiac overhead valve V8. It had 8-to-1 compression, and interestingly enough, it had valve sizes that were very similar to the 283 cubic inch Chevrolet engine that was produced the same year. The intake valve was 1.781 and the exhaust was 1.500. The 283 Chevy had a 1.720 intake valve and same size 1.5 exhaust valve. So I thought that was interesting. Very similar to the 283 cubic inch Chevrolet engine. The 287 had two versions. It had a 7.9-to-1 compression 2-barrel version of the car that made 180 horsepower and 284 foot-pounds of torque. The 4-barrel version of that same engine made 200 horsepower and 278 foot-pounds of torque, and they did bump the compression up a bit for the 4-barrel version of that engine. In 1956, they took the 287 cubic inch engine and they bored the cylinders out to 3.987. It retained 3.250 stroke of the 287. They just made a larger bore, and that brought the cubic inches of the engine to 317. Now again, it was the same block. They just opened up the cylinders and made a larger bore. The 317 was available in 4 different versions. The first one was a 2-barrel version that had 7.9 to 1 compression. It had 192 horsepower and 297 foot-pounds of torque. There was a 4-barrel version where they bumped the compression from 7.9 to 8.9 to 1. It had 216 horsepower and 315 foot-pounds of torque. Now, these first 2 engines that I just mentioned were in vehicles with a standard transmission. At the time, Pontiac also was offering these engines with an automatic transmission or a hydromatic transmission. And what's strange is the automatic transmission versions had different compression ratios and horsepower ratings. The first one was the 2-barrel version with a little higher compression than the standard transmission 2-barrel. It had 205 horsepower and 294 foot-pounds of torque. The 4-barrel version had the same compression ratio, 8.9 to 1, and it had 227 horsepower and 312 foot-pounds of torque. Now, they did offer a higher compression version of the 4-barrel 217. It was their upgraded performance version. It had 10.5 to 1 compression, and it made 285 horsepower and 330 foot-pounds of torque. In 1957, they took the 317 and they extended the stroke from 3.250 to 3.562, so over 3.5 inches. From 3.25 to over 3.5 inches on the stroke. The bore remained the same. Now, there were several versions of the 347 and it was used all across the lines. The first 2-barrel version of the 347 made 227 horsepower and 332 foot-pounds of torque. And that was with a manual transmission. The next version was a 4-barrel version. They bumped the compression up to 10.25 to 1 from the 8.5 to 1 that the 2-barrel version had, bumping the horsepower to 244 and the torque to 350 foot-pounds. They also had a few more versions. The automatic transmission version with the 4-barrel and 10.25 to 1 compression made 270 horsepower and 359 foot-pounds of torque and was available in their higher line of cars. There was also a multiple carburetor version of the 347 that made 317 horsepower, and the torque numbers actually were not available because that engine had some dealer installed parts on it, and they only gave the horsepower rating. They also made available a Rochester mechanical fuel injection that was only available in the Bonnevilles in 1957 with the 347. Unfortunately, fuel injection had gotten a bad rap from some of the other manufacturers that put it out, and it didn't really work well, and they had to actually take it off, and the customer just went through a lot of hassle with it. Even though the Rochester mechanical fuel injection was very similar to what Chevrolet had on their Corvette, and it was actually pretty reliable, it didn't sell well. So the Pontiac fuel injection in the Bonnevilles in 1957 was kind of a dud. Nobody really purchased it. They only made 600 units and they had a difficult time selling those. In 1958, the bore was increased to 4.062 and the 370 cubic inch Pontiac was produced. The 370 cubic inch Pontiac was nicknamed the Tempest by Pontiac. Not to be confused with the Pontiac Tempest vehicle. They actually called this engine the Tempest engine. Fuel injection was also available on select lines of the Tempest, but again, didn't really sell too well. People were just afraid of that in those days. The fuel injection option was also very expensive. It was actually $500 to upgrade to fuel injection. By today's standards, that's about a $6,000 option. So people were really not shelling out the bucks for that fuel injection. The 370 was a fairly potent power plant. It made 310 horsepower and 370 foot-pounds of torque with the 4-barrel carbine. In 1959, they increased the stroke of the 370 to 3 3/4 inches or 3.750, and they retained the same bore as the 370 to produce the 389 cubic inch Pontiac engine. Now the 389 is well known by pretty much everybody, especially Pontiac gurus, and it was a real powerhouse. It was actually one of the first engines that was considered a muscle car engine. It was a fantastic engine and had so many variations that it's almost impossible to list them all. Suffice it to say, it was a very notorious power plant used in many of the Pontiac lines, including the legendary GTOs. This was also the first Pontiac engine to be available with 4-bolt main caps and a windage tray for high performance for high RPMs to keep the oil from swirling. So these were high performance upgrades. The 389 was one of the engines that was known as the trophy engine. And the reason they called it that is because it won so many competitions and races, they dubbed it, hey, this is the engine that's won all these trophies. So the 389 was the trophy engine. There was a ton of versions in this. The base lowest horsepower engine was 215 horsepower, and it ranged all the way up to 368 horsepower and well over 430 foot-pounds of torque in the performance versions of the GTO engines and so forth. And it proved itself to be a very reliable, powerful engine, and it was a very, very potent engine for its day. It got a reputation for being, the GTOs got the reputation in the days of being one of the cars on the street. If you came up beside a 389 GTO, you don't even try because you're going to get smoked. So it was actually had quite a reputation among the muscle car crowd. So it had a pretty significant street rod reputation in those days. There wasn't really anything else at the time that could compete with it. Within a few years, of course, the other manufacturers came on board with their version of street rod. Now there's a couple of engines that I want to throw in here because they go right in line with this year span where we're at. Pontiac did something that was just very unique and quite frankly extremely strange. They built an engine that is without a doubt one of the strangest engines that I have ever seen in all my almost 36 years in the automotive industry. And that was, it's not a V8, but I think we should talk about it because it is a derivative of a V8. They took the 389 Pontiac and they basically chopped it in half. They made a 4-cylinder out of half of that V8. They called this the Trophy 4-cylinder engine. It was a 3.2 liter or 194 cubic inch 4-cylinder, and it was literally half of a Pontiac V8. It had the same bore and stroke as the 389. The only difference is it was missing 4 cylinders. It looked like somebody just took a saw and cut the engine in half, and they were left with this 4-cylinder. Well, that's actually what Pontiac did. I mean, they literally didn't saw it in half, but they just cast a block that was half of the V8. The nice thing is they could use a crankshaft that was similar to the V8 engine. They could use the connecting rods and the pistons and the cylinder head on the one side of the engine, and they made a custom manifold for it. And they actually built a 4-cylinder for some of the smaller line of cars that was half of the V8. This actually is where the term came from, where people said, oh man, I could have had a V8. So the early Pontiac guys can tell you that that was a saying back then when that engine first came out. So just a really interesting engine that kind of goes along with the Pontiac V8s, but is actually not a V8. The other engine I think that we should touch on here that was just a really unique design for Pontiac and actually was the brainchild of John DeLorean when he was an engineer at the time for Pontiac. And that was the inline six-cylinder overhead cam Sprint 6. Pontiac made an overhead cam six-cylinder engine that was actually considered a performance six-cylinder. It had an overhead cam that sat in a cam housing above the rocker shafts. It was driven by a timing belt, and it was known as the Sprint 6. Now, this engine was based on the Chevrolet inline six-cylinder, but Pontiac put their own cylinder head on it and an overhead cam designed engine. When I was a kid, I remember walking through the parking lot of a grocery store and I saw a Firebird, and at the time it was a brand new car. And back in those days, you could pop the hood on a random car in a parking lot and nobody was gonna, try to shoot you or anything. So it was a brand new Firebird, and it said OHC on the hood, which I had never seen. I was a teenager. I was probably 13, 14 years old, and I was already into cars at the time, and I had never seen a Pontiac or anything that said OHC on the hood, and I didn't even know what OHC meant. And I thought, man, back in those days, you didn't pop the hood from in the car, you just pulled the latch outside. So I pulled the latch on this new Pontiac, put the hood up, and it was an inline six-cylinder overhead cam engine. First time I'd ever seen anything like it. I didn't even honestly know what I was looking at the time, but I knew it wasn't a V8. And it was actually in a Firebird that had pretty sporty wheels and stuff and a nice paint job, looked like a street rod. So they did produce that engine, and it actually made pretty decent power. It was designed as an alternative to the V8s to get better economy, but still produced decent power. The 4-barrel version of the 250 cubic inch Sprint 6 had 250 horsepower. So 1 horsepower per cubic inch in that overhead cam six-cylinder. So I know not a V8, but I thought I'd throw it in there because it's one of the interesting and unique things that Pontiac did. They really had some unique engineering. Now, I think it's important to note here that even though Pontiac had the same size block, they did have different main bore sizes. And in this history rundown, I'm going to separate the large journal Pontiacs from the small journal Pontiacs. And they also had 2 engines that were low deck engines that we'll talk about that came out as well. All of the engines that we've talked about so far, and the ones I'm going to continue to talk about here, are the small main journal engines. We'll get to the large journal engines later, and I will designate those when we get to them. In 1963, the A-body GM cars were only allowed to receive a 330 or smaller cubic inch engine, and this was a mandate from General Motors. They actually did this across all of their lines because of insurance purposes. They took the insurance company, the liability insurance company that covered General Motors, said, look, you guys, your engines are getting really powerful and you need to do something about these lighter cars with these big giant engines in them because we think they're dangerous. So they had a mandate that came down for all of the GM divisions, and the mandate for Pontiac said that any intermediate A-body cars, the smaller bodied cars, are only going to be allowed to have a 330 cubic inch V8, no bigger. Now, they actually lifted that later on in 1970, and they were able to, and they ended up putting huge engines in these cars. So the 389 actually was not able to be used in these smaller cars or the intermediate cars because it didn't meet the mandate. So what Pontiac did is they took the 389 and they cast it with a smaller bore. Prior to this, they were using the 215 cubic inch Buick engine in the early 60s, which did fit the mandate of 330 or less. Pontiac, Buick, and Oldsmobile, for that matter, had a lot of problems with the 215. It was just a problematic engine. They wanted to replace it. So what they did is they took the 389 and they cast it with a smaller bore, and they created the 326 cubic inch engine. Originally, it was actually a 336, and then they made the bore even smaller to make it a 326. And so they were able to use the 326 in the intermediate A-body cars. 326 had a bore of 3.720, and it shared the same stroke with the 389 of 3.750. The two-barrel version of the 326 had 260 horsepower and 310 foot-pounds of torque. The four-barrel version had 285 horsepower and 330 foot-pounds of torque. The four-barrel version was considered the performance version of the 326. It also came with dual exhaust and a higher compression ratio to achieve those horsepower numbers. Now, another derivative in 1967 of the 389. So the 326 was a 389 with a smaller bore. Then they took and they bored the 389 out in 1967 to create 400 cubic inches. They took the bore from the standard 389 bore and they punched it out to 4-inch 120 thousandths, and of course it retained the 389 3.750 stroke, and they created the 400 cubic inch Pontiac, which is an engine that is very, very well known by all Pontiac enthusiasts. The two-barrel version of the 400 had 290 horsepower and a whopping 428 foot-pounds of torque. That thing was a real torque monster, even with the two-barrel on it. And it was offered in the full-size cars and the Safari wagon back in those days. Now, the four-barrel version of the 400 a year later got an improved cylinder head. They took and they changed the valve angle of the cylinder head and improved the combustion chamber, and also made a much better breathing head. They took the valve angle from 17 degrees and changed it to 14 degrees, and also made the other improvements that I mentioned with the ports and the combustion chamber as well. The upgraded 400 head also had much larger intake and exhaust valves. The performance version of the 400 had 10.75 to 1 compression in the Ram Air version, and it had 360 horsepower and 445 foot-pounds of torque. Another thing that was done with the 400 is it was put in some of the vehicles, and it was called the HO version. It had the same compression and the good heads, but they also, what they did with those vehicles is they put dual exhaust on them. They put a better breathing intake, and they put a 430 rear gear in the car, which really made that thing accelerate hard on the street from a dead stop. It increased the acceleration capability of the vehicle. In the mid-70s, the 400 was used in the Trans Ams, also known as the Shaker 6.6 liter. The 400s actually got bit by the smog and emissions and cafe bug as well. However, they were pretty decent, but they weren't as high in horsepower and compression ratio as the late 60s, early 70s version. The 6.6 TA 400 had 200 horsepower and 325 foot-pounds of torque. The reduction in the power was largely due to, like I say, the emissions regulations and the restrictions that were put on the manufacturers by the EPA. But nevertheless, it still was a decent engine in the 6.6 liter TA or Trans Am, and Formula Firebird as well. Now, in 1968, Pontiac also introduced another engine, which was their 350 cubic inch engine. Now, this also had the same stroke as the 400 and the 389, but they reduced the cylinder bore to 3.875 to produce 350 cubic inches. This was found in some of the smaller, lighter bodied cars. The two-barrel version of the 350 was kind of unimpressive. It had 200 horsepower, but there were HO versions of the 350 and some of the Formula Firebird that had 330 horsepower and 385 foot-pounds of torque. And those vehicles featured dual exhaust, higher compression, better intake manifold, hotter camshaft, and of course the Ram Air hood. So the formulas were actually pretty potent with the HO 350 in it. Not a bad engine. It definitely wasn't terrible. They did a pretty good job of making a decent power plant out of the 350 HO. Now, in 1969, here's an engine I think we should touch on. It was actually never sold to the public, used specifically for competing in the Trans Am racing series. Chevrolet had the 302 that they produced for the same purpose, and of course the Ford 302 is also a competitor. Pontiac had the 303 cubic inch engine. Now this engine had a 4.125 bore, very large bore, and a very short stroke of 2.840. So short stroke, big bore, high revving engine, much like the other 302s. And it was a high compression engine, and like I said, was never sold to the public. Now, The requirements for Trans Am racing was that it had to be a production engine. Pontiac kind of cheated a little bit. They built another engine similar to the 303, which was a 301, but it was a completely different engine. It did have a large bore. The 301 had a 4-inch bore and a 3-inch stroke. And it was also a short deck block, just like the 303. And they did put it in the mid-70s through about 1980-ish. They put it in some Firebirds and some Trans Ams, and they even had a turbo version of it. But to be honest, I mean, the downside of the 301 is that it just had terrible cylinder heads on it. It had Siamese intake ports, and they just didn't flow good at all. The turbo version made 135 horsepower and 210 foot-pounds of torque with 9 pounds of boost. But the thing is, Pontiac was not trying to make a real high horsepower engine out of that. That wasn't their goal. They simply made that to satisfy the Trans Am rules. And they said, hey, look, you know, we produced it. It's very similar to the 303, only the 303 was a factory hot rod engine with really good heads and a big cam and high compression and so forth. But it was similar in architecture to the 301 that they produced, so they got away with it. In 1980 and 81, they also produced another engine that was basically an offshoot of the 301, and that was a 265 cubic inch low deck block. And this was just a plain Jane stalker. Some of their smog era cars, much like the small cubic inch Oldsmobile, it was just designed get you from A to B, get good mileage. It was a lightened up block, and not really much of a performance engine at all, but it was a pretty reliable engine. Didn't really have a lot of problems with it, and so it was for a stock plain Jane, get you around town, get you where you need to go engine, it was not bad. It had about 120 horsepower. By 1982, the Pontiac engines had disappeared from the scene. They were just done away with, and actually some of the Pontiacs, before they killed the brand, used the Chevy engine, which was considered the GM corporate engine, the 305. We're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about the large journal Pontiac engines. I know a lot of you have probably been waiting for this. Now, keep in mind, the blocks were exactly the same externally. They just had a larger main journal. Now, a larger main journal means a much bigger crankshaft. That's not necessarily a good thing. It does make a stronger crankshaft, but the fact remains that a larger main journal is limiting the RPM capability of the engine. The larger the main journal, the higher the bearing surface speed at a given RPM. In fact, it's been rumored that Smokey Yunick left Pontiac over a dispute about this main journal size change. For some of their bigger engines, some of the engineers said, you know, we need a bigger crank, we need a bigger journal, and Smokey Yunick was like, no, you're gonna limit the RPM capability of the engine, and you're gonna be smoking main bearings if it gets over revved. And there was such a disagreement that Smokey Yunick actually left Pontiac. And that was in 1960-61 when Pontiac was designing the 421 cubic inch large journal V8. Well, even though Smokey Yunick protested and didn't want any part of it and actually left the company, Pontiac still produced the large journal V8s. And, you know, in their defense, they turned out pretty good. The RPMs are limited on those, and one of the things that does happen to the larger journal Pontiacs is if you over rev them, you smoke the main, so he was right about that. The 421 cubic inch Pontiac had a bore of 4.937 and a 4-inch stroke. So it was a longer stroke and a bigger bore than any of the other engines that they had made with the smaller journals. There were several versions of the 421. They had single 4-barrel, dual 4-barrel. They also had tri-power 3 2-barrel carburetors for this engine, and it was considered by them to be one of their high performance engines. It was a very, very good engine and was actually used in higher performance versions in NASCAR racing by some of the NASCAR teams, and NHR drag racing as well. The HO version of the 421 with dual 4-barrel carburetors designed for street use was 376 horsepower and 410 foot-pounds of torque. But of course, the racing versions of the engines were much higher horsepower and compression. In 1967, Pontiac bored the cylinders out larger to 4.120 and retained the 421's 4-inch stroke to make a 428 cubic inch engine. This engine was designed by Pontiac to be a direct competitor to the Chevy and the Ford 427s that year. Now, what's interesting is the manufacturer had a mandate that they could not put an engine of this size into a Firebird or the scaled down GTO in 1968, but there were some dealers that were doing that. They offered what they called the Bobcat option, and they were actually swapping the 428 into some Firebirds and GTOs and selling them. They were able to get around the insurance rules by doing that. But the 428 HO was never installed in those cars from the factory in '67. The 428 HO street version had 390 horsepower and 425 foot-pounds of torque. And it was also available with dual 4-barrels, a single 4-barrel, or 3 2-barrel carburetors installed by the dealer. In 1970, Pontiac increased the bore and the stroke to produce the 455 cubic inch engine. Now, the 455 was a real powerhouse. It was also a large journal engine, of course. The 1970 455 HD, or they called it the heavy duty, was rated at 370 horsepower, but most sources are saying that that's way underrated. And I would agree with them. I've seen some dyno tests. Most sources say that the horsepower of that engine was a lot closer to 410 to 415. So GM was playing the horsepower dumbed down game in 1970 because of a lot of pressure from the EPA and from insurance companies. Now, one of the things that was cool is that the cubic inch restrictions were lifted by GM in 1970, and so the 455 was able to be used in pretty much all of the large cars and the mid-size cars, the Firebird, the GTO, and so forth. And so they were available. The Ram Air 1, 2, 3, and 4 came out during those years. And there was a lot of different versions of the 455 that were available in multiple different cars. GM said their highest rating was 370 horsepower and 500 foot-pounds of torque, which was pretty decent. The Buick, I believe, had a 455 that was like 510 foot-pounds of torque or something like that. So it was in line with the other big blocks, but it was a real powerhouse, especially in the Firebirds and the GTOs with the Ram Air and the dual exhaust and the 4-speeds and the short ratio gears and so forth. Those things were real screamers back in the day. The 455 HD was also available with 4-bolt main caps, a windage tray, a high volume oil pump, and a reinforced nodular iron crankshaft. Unfortunately, by 1976, just like all of the other big blocks, the 455 Pontiac was done. It went away, and they got into some of the lower horsepower stuff. But if you're looking for a very solid, reliable powerhouse engine, the 455 was a fantastic engine. The 421 and the 428 were also fantastic engines, but to be honest, those engines are very hard to find anymore. They're getting scarce. The 455 Pontiacs are still out there. You can find them and you can build them. The 400 Pontiacs are also readily available. It's the smaller journal version, but the 400 has a lot of potential, especially with the stroker kits and cranks that are available today. So that is Pontiac history. I hope you enjoyed this. And again, I'm just touching on what they did through the years with their different engines, what they produced. I'm sure there's a lot more that could be added to all of this, but time doesn't permit me to do that. Pontiacs are fantastic engines, along with Oldsmobile and Buick. Actually, 3 of my favorites. I'm also a big Ford fan too. I know that some of the GM guys are gonna pull their hair out when they say that, but it is what it is. So I appreciate you watching, and next we are going to do American motors. So I hope there are some American motors, some AMC fans out there. They actually had some pretty decent engines over the years. And of course, they had Jeep in there for a certain amount of time. So we're going to do AMC or American motor history next. And I hope you will stay tuned for that. Be sure to like and subscribe. Hit that thumbs up button. That really helps get this video out there. And I will talk to you all very soon, I promise. Thanks for watching.